Welcome to the Capital Forum's interview series. My name's Teddy Downey, and we're delighted to have Barry Lynn here with us today. As background, Barry is the director of the Markets, Enterprise, and Resiliency Initiative and a senior fellow at the New America Foundation. He's author of Cornered, The New Monopoly Capitalism, and also of End of the Line, the rise and coming fall of the global corporation. And today at the ABA conference, there's been a lot of talk about consumer welfare and other concepts of citizen welfare or citizen well-being as ways to measure antitrust harm. I wanted to get your thoughts. What's your view of how consolidation and market power affect citizens?
You know, consolidation is bad for citizens in a number of ways, and foremost, what it leads to is concentrated political power. There's another way in which concentration is bad for citizens, and that's that citizens end up with fewer options as workers. They can't go out and bring their labor into different places. They can't sell their labor in different marketplaces. So what it means is fundamentally less liberty, less opportunity, and a more concentrated political environment.
And what do you think about how consumer welfare as a test for antitrust has become the norm? How did that happen, and how do you see that potentially changing?
You know, we have to keep in mind that for 200 years, this is going back to the founding. It's really going back to before the founding. The main test is concentrated power a danger to the citizen. So consumer welfare is something that's really quite new. It was brought to the fore back in the late 1970s and the early 1980s, and so what we've seen since the sort of adoption of this consumer welfare test, which is really an efficiency test. It's like anything that's more efficient, we should probably give a pass to. We should allow it to happen. What we've seen since that change, which is only 30 years ago, is a pretty radical consolidation of power in most sections of the U.S. economy.
And can you give us some examples maybe of how, in a specific industry, how concentrated power affects the everyday citizen?
Well, for instance, say a generation ago, at the time when a guy named Sam Walton out in Arkansas wanted to start a company selling groceries or selling sort of general merchandise to his neighbors, he was able to go out and do that. It was very easy to do that. It was very easy to break in. Now, because there's a giant company that has a name on it, a company that has 4,500 outlets, that has this immense buying power. Anyone who wants to do the same thing that Sam Walton did will find it really, really hard. The same is true in restaurants, the same is true in plumbing, the same. It's just that throughout the economy, the opportunity to go out and provide for yourself, to start a new venture, it could be. This is true also in technology, and software, and it's like, so what you see is the opportunity to go out and sort of make a new venture, provide for your family. It's much harder than it was a generation ago.
And in terms of, are there? So we looked at sort of Walmart, the Walmart effect. Are there any other industries, like pharmaceutical industries, industries where you really see big companies, making lots of money or being intertwined with the government? What are the issues with consolidation in industries like healthcare, for instance, and pharmaceutical companies?
Well, we see this with, pretty much any sector that you look at, you will find vastly greater concentration of power than we had a generation ago. There's a few exceptions, and it's easier to actually count the exceptions than it is to talk about where there is concentration. One exception is automobiles. You actually see more competition in automobiles than a generation ago, and that's about it. But when you get to medical devices, when you get to medical services, when you get to pharmaceuticals, when you get to farming, when you get to agricultural services, in every single instance you see fewer suppliers, you see fewer buyers, you see less opportunity, you see more concentration of control, you see higher prices, you see more manipulation of the political system by powerful groups.
And not to be redundant, but if we look at the harms and if you look at consumer welfare and just this concept of consumer welfare, if you're going to, there seems to be a big focus on price. What are some of the other things that antitrust regulators and policymakers, in your opinion, should look at in terms of looking at how consolidation affects the citizen?
I mean, foremost, you should always look to see if someone is concentrating sufficient wealth and power to manipulate the government. And if that's the case, the people's government, the public government, if that's the case, then that's an instance in which the regulators, the antitrust enforcers should step in. If you see any case in which a previously open marketplace has been closed, and this means suddenly it's like, I don't have the opportunity to go and create a grocery store. I don't have the opportunity to go and create a garage at the corner. That's a case in which I believe antitrust enforcers should step in. That's actually a right that was recognized in this country for hundreds of years. That is now pretty much precluded in many cases. One of the things that I wrote about in my first book, and I still work on a lot, is the effects of concentrated power on the stability of complex systems, industrial systems. And good for instance is if you have 10 factories that are making a particular component. It could be a piston ring for a car. It could be a semiconductor. If you have 10 places around the world that make this one component, then you can have a disaster anywhere in the world. You could lose one factory, you could lose two factories, but the system will continue to function. What we see nowadays is often just one factory serving the entire world. That makes the entire system radically more unstable, radically more subject to shocks than what we had a generation ago. That's something that trust busters should be looking at.
And in terms of people. Maybe we can move on to the second question I've got here. So if there is a big impact on citizens, which I think you've made a pretty compelling case for, should policymakers beyond just the antitrust agencies, policymakers on the Hill and the White House care more about this impact? Is updating the merger laws or merger enforcement guidelines, is that the only option, or what are the other ways that policymakers can be involved here?
Well, I mean, policymakers can change this tomorrow if they choose to. Congress can go in and make a statement tomorrow that would change radically how we enforce our competition policies in this country. The Obama administration tomorrow can make a statement that will radically change how we enforce our competition policies. They can establish new guidelines, and this is, basically explain to the world how and why they're going to enforce the laws towards a different end. So we could see a radically different world beginning tomorrow if Congress chose to act, if the Obama administration chose to act. But the people of the United States should, if this doesn't happen, then this is really a political issue. I mean, what people have to understand is that antitrust is not really fundamentally an economic issue. It is foremost a political issue. It is an issue of do we allow people to concentrate power? Do we allow people to take over entire marketplaces and govern those marketplaces for their own good, not for our good, not for the good of society as a whole, just for their own good? And therefore, since the outcomes are political, we have to fight it politically. If we don't like it, and we should not like it, we need to join hands and we need to go fight it.
And what's your, so a lot of the ABA, one of the big panels was about how politics and sort of technical enforcement overlap, and there was a big debate on whether or not there's a difference between different antitrust enforcement philosophies and how politics is involved there. What's your sense of how, historically, this went from being a political issue to sort of something governed more by consensus and technocratic implementation?
Well, I mean, anytime you see a system that is mainly technocratic, it's the result of one or two things. It's either a result of people trying to avoid what is fundamentally political in the system. And that's what we see today. We see people basically saying, oh, it's really not political, it's technical, and basically using that as an excuse not to deal with what's the political outcomes. The other time that we see, the other case in which we see people sort of using technical frame to, and this is more effective, is when you actually have a clear political framework that you have applied. You have a clear set of political principles. This is what markets are going to look like. This is the minimum number of companies we're going to accept in any competitive market. And when you have something that is, when you have these clear a clear framework, when you have a clear set of principles, that's a way, a point at which you can actually turn over some power safely to the technocrats. But when you don't have those principles in place, when you don't have that framework in place, the technocrats simply obscure the fact that you're seeing massive concentration of power, dangerous concentration of power, as we see today.
My next question is, the Capital Forum has clients that are investors, and one of the reasons we started the business was because we thought that some investors don't really fully appreciate how market power affects how markets play out. That there's not perfect competition, and so you really do need to understand the nuance of market power. And do you agree with that statement that investors don't fully appreciate market power? And what are the ways, if yes, what are the ways in which they don't really look at it? So you talked earlier about systemic risks and supply chain fragility. Maybe we can talk about that some more.
Yeah, this is actually one of the cases in which I've really expected investors to take a closer look at a risk that puts them in really great peril all the time, and more so every day. And this is this issue that we talked about before, which is when you have real hyper concentration of productive capacity, when you make all of a certain kind of semiconductor in one place, or all of a certain kind of piston ring in one place, that if there's a event that cuts you off from that factory, it could be an earthquake, it could be a cyber attack, it could be some kind of a conflict, a political conflict, say between Japan and China. Anything that would cut you off from access to that source of supply means that all the systems that depend on that source of supply come to a screeching halt for the period of time when you don't have access to that. And this could be, depending on the product, it could be weeks, it could be months, it could be years. It's, some factories it takes years to build a new factory. So we're talking about a level of risk that is extremely high. And we've actually seen numerous cases of crashes, industrial crashes. We saw one in September of 1999. There was an earthquake in Taiwan, broke the supply of certain kind of semiconductors. Within a few days, all these factories in the United States were shut down. We saw it after September 11. We saw it during the SARS sort of epidemic in 2003. We saw it really big time just 2 years ago after that giant earthquake in Japan in March of 2011. There was just really quite phenomenal effects that stretched entirely around the world. So this is a case in which investors can have a real effect on how companies act. They can have a real effect on how states act, and investors are not looking at this in a coherent way. This is not a case in which you can make maybe you get lucky, you make some money shorting something, but if you don't play this right, there's not a whole lot left to short.
And so it sounds like the auto industry clearly was affected by the earthquake in Japan. What other kinds of companies? You mentioned tech companies. So would a company like Apple potentially be exposed if they have just-in-time sort of manufacturing and delivery for their products?
Well, Apple is exposed in many ways. I mean, that was because of this concentration of capacity. So Apple is exposed in the sense that they have most of their productive capacity in Shenzhen in South China. Anything that breaks us off from South China means that all those products don't get to the rest of the world. That's a big problem for Apple. That's a problem for Apple in two ways. They're exposed to supply breaks because of an earthquake, because of a storm, but they're also they're exposed to political pressure. I mean, the fact is they're on the other side of another nation's border. That nation can apply all kinds of pressure to that company in ways that it's really hard for us to see. They actually just last week, I believe it was, Beijing brought a huge amount of pressure on on Apple, and they sort of forced Tim Cook to kowtow, to apologize, to sort of get on his knees before the authorities in Beijing and sort of show who was boss. Now, if I'm an investor in Apple, I'd say that's a pretty big potential problem, because here you have, this is a political power that can be used in ways that harm Apple really quite substantially, and it's because of the concentration. It's because of the fact that Apple has made itself vulnerable by putting all of its eggs in one basket.
And what are some of the ways that maybe they could protect against the concentration risk there?
Traditionally, engineers traditionally say, well, it's really quite simple. You don't put all your eggs in one basket. You don't build a table with one leg. You spread your weight around, you spread your risk around, you spread your capacity around. You make sure that you're always dual sourced, you're always triple sourced. The companies, the automakers in Detroit, they used to routinely triple source if they were buying something from outside the company. They would make sure that the factories are spread out. So this is just a basic rule, a basic smart way of doing business. And over the last generation, because of this kind of fixation on efficiency, because of this urge towards monopoly, what we've seen is the entire industrial system of the world become sort of reoriented around these nodes of nodes of super concentrated capacity.
And are there examples of governments having risk as well? I mean, you mentioned that companies can have risk, but this whole rare earths situation with the U.S. comes to mind. Maybe you could talk about that, or other examples of where the government maybe puts too many of its eggs in one basket.
Well, I mean, it's really the government's acting on our behalf. So, in the case of the government's sitting by and allowing large American companies to put large capacities of industrial activity on the other side of a border that we don't control, but it's capacity that we need. Maybe it's like the production of chemicals that go in our food system, or the production of chemicals that go in our drug system, or these semiconductors, or capacitors, or whatever it is. When our government allows large companies like Apple or IBM or GE to put these capacitors in one place, to rely on the production of some important item in one place on the other side of a border, that is a gross about as gross a negligence that we can imagine in our government, because they have allowed us to be put into a sort of immediate and extreme peril by this action.
And one of the things we were talking about before had to do with the auto companies having supply chain risk, and that potentially having a ramification on the U.S. economy writ large, because buying automobiles is a big part of the U.S. economy. What other macroeconomic effects can there be from consolidation?
Well, consolidation, and we know this, and this goes back, to hundreds of years. But consolidation can have a really bad effect on jobs. We see it. You see it in two levels. You see it whenever there's mergers. One of the first things that's going to happen when two large companies merge is they're going to toss out a whole bunch of the people that are under the roof of the new combined corporation. I mean, in some cases, we've seen some pharmaceutical mergers the last few years in which 10, 20, 30,000 people are fired. These are often chemists. These are some of the best trained people in our land end up being thrown on the street after a merger. Going forward, it's like anytime you have a consolidated enterprise, they're going to hire less. They're going to innovate less. And this is a really big issue. Another big issue is the effects on innovation. When you have one company that dominates an entire realm, they don't have external stimulus to push them towards bringing better ideas to the marketplace. They don't have an external push to get them to improve their processes, to lower their prices. So we have all kinds of technologies that are that could be integrated into systems that we rely on now. They're not being integrated because of this lack of competition.
And I think you've done a lot of work on not just jobs, but also wages. And that's a big macroeconomic issue right now, is the disparity between profitability of corporations and the average wage of workers these days. Is there any kind of link to potentially antitrust enforcement and consolidation and this wage gap?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge issue. I mean, anytime whatever it is, whatever your skill is, whenever you're bringing your skill to market to sell it, you know that if there are 5 companies that are bidding for your skill, bidding for your work, you're living in a better world, and you're going to probably enjoy better wage and better treatment than if there's one company that's bidding for your work. So, what we've seen in this country is, because of this radical consolidation, case after case after case, many of our workers, and this is true of doctors, it's true of lawyers, it's true of scientists and engineers, and it's true of people who work at the places like Walmart. They have fewer places that are bidding, fewer ventures that are bidding for their work than was true 10 years ago. And in some cases, here's a case in which the trust busters actually did something recently, which was that what we found out is that a number of very large companies in Silicon Valley, including Google and Apple, were conspiring with one another not to poach each other's workers. They had an agreement at the board level not to poach each other's workers. So this is a case in which the DOJ actually felt they had proof of this, and they went and they got these guys to agree publicly not to do this anymore. So here's a case in which some of the very biggest, richest companies in America, which are outrageously profitable, still they're using their power to, in ways that they conspire in order to drive down the wages and reduce the freedom, some basic freedoms of their scientists, of their engineers. The freedom to move from company to company, which is a pretty basic freedom, restricted by companies like Apple, by companies like Google. I mean, this is an outrageous sort of situation that has really evoked remarkably little outrage among the population. I mean, we should all be outraged about this. This is something to get really angry about.
I think citizens, policymakers care a lot about, especially those in New York, is this the situation with the DOJ and their case against the publishers, the book publishers. I know you've done a lot of work on that. Are they getting that right? Are they pursuing the right idea there in their case against the publishers, or are they missing the point?
I mean, it's a good question, because the DOJ has not done a whole lot when it comes to antitrust these last couple of years under Obama. But one of the cases they did bring was in the publishing industry, and it was a case in which the publishers went to the DOJ and they said, "Hey, we got a problem here, which is that this single giant company, Amazon, is really emerging as the monopolist, the most dominant retailer in the entire business. They sell a company that sells." It could be 50, 60, 70%, 80% of certain lines of books. So it's a situation, if you're selling 60, 70, 80% of your product across one platform, you are subject to that platform. You do what the people who run that platform tell you to do. So the publishers went to the DOJ and they said, this is a problem. And then the DOJ came and they looked at what was going on, and rather than taking the case against Amazon, they actually brought a case against the publishers. And they said the publishers were, and the reason they did this is because they said the publishers were advocating for higher prices. When all they were actually advocating for was an open marketplace, a competitive marketplace, a marketplace in which there was not a single dominant sovereign boss company in the middle of it that basically is able to dictate terms to everybody. So it was kind of sad. Well-meaning people. I know the people in the DOJ who made the decision. They're well-meaning people. They made the wrong decision, and they made the wrong decision precisely. And this is because they were focused on this issue of consumer welfare. Amazon was able to convince them that the way they use their power results in lower-priced books, and that's good for the consumer. So here's a case in which power over the people who publish our book was concentrated, and the DOJ had an opportunity to break that power, and instead they validated that power because they had the wrong idea in their head.
And maybe we could talk for a little bit about how this concept and getting back to Walmart, getting back to monopsony power, and this idea of lower price. What is that the same? Is that the same concept that allows for Walmart to have the same type of impact on its suppliers?
Yeah, no, I mean monopsony power. It's the case where there's a single buyer who is, or a single retailer, a single sort of market manager that is dominant enough that you have to meet the terms that they demand of you because you have no place else to sell. So what we've seen with Walmart is in many of the many cities in America, they sell half of the groceries already. But nationally, they sell at 40%, 50%, in some cases close to 60% of certain lines of goods. So this gives them essentially, the same way that Amazon has the power to dictate terms to the publishers, Walmart has the power to dictate terms to many of its suppliers.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah. Sorry. Oh, okay. So, and to wrap things up, there's been a little bit of interest, and we met with some people who are some lawyers who are trying to start a new school of economic thought called the South Dakota School of Antitrust, where they're broadening the scope of consumer to this idea of citizen. How does this policy or consolidation affect the citizen? Would you say that Walmart and Amazon that's a big risk to them if this starts to pick up steam?
Yeah, I wouldn't worry about Amazon or Walmart anytime soon. They're not going to suddenly vanish from the world, even if we get our laws right. I mean, they're so large and they're so dominant that they're going to be safe for a while. But the fact that there is a move, any move whatsoever, to go back to a more common sense approach to sort of conceiving of how to enforce our antitrust laws, that's a really good thing. The idea of refocusing, saying, we're not going to focus anymore on the welfare of the consumer. We're going to say, hey, this is really an issue of the liberties of the citizen. That's not just a good thing, that's a necessary thing. And the sooner it happens, the better. And
last question, a lot of the people at the ABA conference were really talking about how since 1982, the antitrust community has really learned a lot, or there's been a big progression in thought. It seemed, but there was a big debate about that. So you're firmly on the side of things were better before this implementation of a sort of new philosophy in the consumer welfare test.
Absolutely. In fact, the best things that we have today, the only areas in our economy that have been actually really functioning well, which are in the information technology space, and that's actually starting to slow down. But the only area where we've seen actually real advance are the areas where the trust busters were most active back in the 60s and 70s. So, yeah, the ways that we used to do things until 1982, it's better politically, it was better economically, and again, the sooner we get back to the proper way of using our antitrust laws, which is to divide power, to make markets, to protect liberties, the better it is for all of us.
Thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me.